It's wonderful to be here in such eminent and fascinating company. So my talk today focuses on, or begins with, a single photograph taken in England on the 14th of August 1987. It's a modest effort, it's a glossy colour print, it's developed commercially. It's a portrait where a finger has encroached in front of the lens and the subject's feet are all that is visible, and a processor's sticker, photo processor's sticker, points out its faults. I came across this photo in about 2005 when I began to research an archive of 55,000 photographs that had been submitted to a major one-day event staged in Britain, organised as a fundraiser for a cancer charity which was called One Day for Life. The organisers invited everyone in Britain to take a photograph of everyday life on one ordinary summer's day. Submitted prints, which were accompanied by a £1 donation, were judged by professionals, and a winning selection was produced as a family album of the nation, as they called it. But that finger in the lens photograph didn't make the final cut. Instead, it joined the more than 99% of the collection that were marked as rejects, those ordinary amateur photographs that were deemed too ordinary and too amateurish to be awarded or published. I spent several years looking at every photo in that archive while also surveying hundreds of participants, organisers, judges and archivists to reconstitute the project's history and to grasp the meaning of a phenomenon that was described at the time as the biggest photographic event the world had ever seen. As a large-scale cross-section of a nation's photographs, and as an early example of crowdsourced media, I've used the collection in several ways. I've used it to offer pre-histories of user-generated documentaries, which have been made globally more possible with the coming of digital tools in the 21st century, when the moment-in-time cross-section has become a popular publishing form. This is a couple of examples of film and a book from the 2010s. I've also used the collection to think about methodological approaches to the photographic mass, both as a microcosm of the popular practice of mass photography, but also as a model of how to get the measure of masses of photographs, especially those that now proliferate and, to some critics, threaten to overwhelm us, as visualised, for example, in this tidal wave scene assembled by artist Eric Kessels here in 2014, who printed a sample of 950 photographs uploaded to Flickr in 24 hours. And I've also used the collection and my analysis of it to understand more recent manifestations of crowdsourced public photography and the projects that imitate it in some ways. And these especially emerged all over the world in the COVID-19 lockdowns, where photography was used as a means of community building in times of isolation and of amateur history making, and where amateur photography again became an accessible tool for recording new sites and new shared experiences, from empty streets and masking to home haircuts and home baking. Yet in an archive that is vast and whose implications have taken my thinking far and wide, I keep returning to this one photograph. Among the 55,000, it stood out, firstly because it made me laugh, also because it impressed me with its self-consciousness. This was not only an example of an amateur photograph taken on one day in 1987, but it was also a photograph about amateur photography. Its erroneousness became symbolic, and its submission to a competition shows the awareness of its maker. And I'm going to use this photo in my talk as a departure point to several different bodies of work and to several different clusters of ideas. So the subject of this photograph might be obscured, but I would like to argue that it reveals much of popular photography as a form. And firstly, I find that this photograph offers a striking counterpoint to the critiques of amateur photographers as ignorant button pressers, unthinkingly reproducing cliches. So as I surveyed the 55,000 photographs in the one-day archive, I also surveyed academic analysis of amateur and popular photography, especially as written in the period of this photograph's making, so in the 1980s and 1990s. And I observed how widely and how regularly the practice was dismissed as a cultural form. When judged aesthetically, popular photographs were frequently described in the most condemnatory language as banal, trite, stultifying, and sentimental. And its producers were similarly dismissed, perceived to be as intellectually rudimentary as the simple-to-operate cameras that they typically used. So, to take one example, sociologist Don Slater wrote at the time that the mass of photography, snap shooting, is hardly a conscious activity at all. But my ethnographic research showed that even photographers who described themselves as merely a snap shooter, or perhaps as a very amateur, had a high degree of consciousness about the photographs they took and striking reflectiveness on their meanings and their purposes. In the context of that particular archive too, those submitting photographs clearly had public, participatory and competitive ambition for their pictures. They had been provided to with instructions which they may or may not have adhered to, but which nonetheless constituted a brief. So the resulting photographs could not be described as random or lacking in intention. They were never unthinking. Whoops. There are photographs in that archive that show technical complexity and professional finish. Indeed, some of the participants treated the project as merely one photographic competition among many that they entered. They aimed to produce a winning entry that demonstrated their pictorial accomplishments. But I was intrigued in particular by the much larger body of submissions that were flawed. The majority, in fact, are blurred, overexposed, out of focus, and indistinct, with subjects too far away or too close to be seen. And these serve a different purpose in the context of that archive's charity function. They were among the many submissions where the pound donation to charity was more important than the photographic accompaniment. And they were symbols, too, of participation in a national collective project rather than merely photo competitors. They often showed their photographic meaning beyond the frame. So the fuller story of that archive and its implications, I have elaborated in a couple of different book publications that put that material to theoretical and methodological use. And since then, I've written several other books about several other photographic archives, but still, this photograph haunts me. And more recently, I've returned to it again, and particularly to revisit another of its elements, which is the quality control sticker. So the quality control sticker reads, print quality appears to have been affected by one of the following: finger or object partly covering lens, faulty wind on, double exposure, grossly under or overexposed. And this judgment label reveals another structural element beyond the intentions of the photographer or the photograph's institutional and archival contexts. It reveals the viewpoint and the intention and the intervention of the photo processor. And those are shaping elements in the history of popular photographic production, even though commercial photo processing is mostly overlooked in photographic history. Indeed, it is often intentionally rendered invisible in photographic production. But photo processors' stickers, where they appear, jarringly overlay the photographs beneath, shouting down their message by adding a dominant other voice. Quality control stickers were common sights on prints produced commercially on the high street in 1980s and 1990s Britain, and a wide array were produced for a variety of different defects. But other photo processors' interventions exist, of course, in other national locations. The artist Roberto Martinez, for example, collected and published a series of French Photolab stickers marked non-facture, so not charged, in his 1995 photo book of reality principles. And more recently, an artist also interested in photographic structures, Megan Gould from America, has produced a more recent photo book entitled Sorry No Pictures, which was inspired by a photographic failure sticker from Dwayne's Photolab in Parsons, Kansas, which is a site of some photographic fame. It's the last laboratory to process Kodachrome film. I've got a small collection of my own Photolab stickers from various international locations. This one is from Australia, in an example that seems to gently acknowledge the error while financially compensating the customer. And there are also some more positive lab stickers, albeit rather hesitant, praising selected photographs to promote further print sales. In Britain in the 1990s, notably after the date of that One Day for Life finger in the lens photograph, British artists too began to playfully engage with the quality control sticker as a motif. So Stephen Bull, for example, who collects found photographs, exhibited stickered prints in 1994 that he characterises as a three-way collaboration between himself as the artist, the photographer of the found photograph, and the lab worker. Renowned fashion photographer Tim Walker, then at the beginning of his career while in his 20s, assembled a spread for Vogue Italia in 1998 entitled Amateur Photography in London, which consciously staged photographic errors captioned with broken rules to disrupt fashion's glossy perfection and to communicate authenticity and spontaneity. The photographic quality control sticker in Britain has a very specific origin in the company known as Boots the Chemist. This was founded in 1849 as a single herbalist shop in Nottingham in England, and it expanded in the years that commercial film developing and printing services became established on the high street as high street chemist byproducts. In 1890, Boots had 10 shops. By 1900, they had over 200. By the start of the Second World War, they had over 1,000 branches, and by the 1970s, nearly 2,000. Boots' rising fortunes in those years were closely connected to popular photography. By the 1950s, they were the largest photographic retailers in Britain, and their name remained synonymous with British high street film processing until the end of the 20th century. In their internal documentation, they said they particularly served what they called the happy snapper, or low-fuss picture taker, that person who typically took just 1 to 2 rolls of film a year, on holiday or with friends and family. The so-called man in the street, for Boots, was in fact most often a woman. In the 1980s, a Boots advertising campaign called Film Processing Without the Negatives outlined the company's professional credentials by a portrait of a young woman in a lab coat and white gloves, holding a photograph and a magnifying loupe. Customers are assured, quote, "In our lab, we cast an expert eye over each and every print." By a scattered array of quality control stickers and a colour-cast print of Big Ben, the company stated, quote, "Beheaded, fuzzy or washed out, we'll tell you where we think you went wrong." And they offered a promise of satisfaction, which guaranteed an immediate refund or reprint. But the unspoken part of that promise was that this would only happen if the error was on the processor's side. So quality control stickers ostensibly offered customer support and guidance to becoming a better photographer, but in a business context, they were actually an apportioning of blame. An internal Boots photo quality guide of the same period offers a visual reference for customer errors, carefully distinguishing those that might be on a fault on the customer's side from incorrect loading of the film, to poor lighting conditions where no improvements could be made to the order, to those that were laboratory failings, such as incorrect colour balance or printing in reverse, in which case the customer could be entitled to a reprint free of charge. And this guide is fascinating. It's both a document of issues and a sample of popular practice in the period: holiday snaps, babies and children, pets and parties. And the guide very literally demonstrates norms which are ostensibly technical, but it is irresistible to read the centralised white man in this picture as a gendered and racialised norm too. As the guide trained staff to identify customer errors, we find a similar looking image, a protruding digit in the lens among those problems for which the lab is not responsible, and here the finger is accusatorially pointed back at the photographer. So this moving finger in the lens, to playfully paraphrase the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam and later Agatha Christie's novel, this moving finger has pointed me in a new direction through which to understand popular photography, through the history of the services that supported it and the structures that literally hold it. And by that, I mean the popular face or the public face of photo processing, made manifest still in many people's homes by enduring scenes such as this. Under the beds or on top of wardrobes of those old enough to predate digital cameras and smartphones, where prints and negatives are commonly still held in the paper envelopes in which the processors returned them, or the mail order developers sent them back. And I've been collecting these humble items for more than a decade, and I have perhaps 1,000 examples. And in my most recent book, More Than a Snapshot, I pulled together 100 to show a century of photographic change. So photo wallets are another normative form, reinforcing, for example, heterosexual relationships and nuclear families bound together through photographic rituals. They domesticate racial hierarchies, and they provide particular purviews of leisure rather than labour. Photo wallets only depict what should go on in front of the lens, and when Kodak coined their famous late 19th century catchphrase, "You press the button, we do the rest," they deliberately drew a veil over the factory work behind the scenes. But in the shadows of the commercial darkroom, a low-paid, mostly female workforce was processing prints by the million, as seen here in the Kodak works in 1923 in England. As camera ownership expanded and incomes improved throughout the 20th century, so too did photographic quantities. In 1976, famously Britain's hottest summer, holiday snaps grew like never before. The workers who produced them, however, toiled in windowless buildings without air conditioning, where overtime was compulsory. In the Grunwick Photo Processing Lab in Willesden in London, the long hours and low pay suffered by the majority women, 80% Asian and 10% Afro-Caribbean workers, came to a head in 1976 with a mass walkout of all 440 employees in a strike that lasted 2 years. And this strike highlighted the poor treatment of migrant workers, but also the conflict showed trade union picket tactics and police brutality, but it also revealed much of how the mail order photo processing business worked. Photo wallets, meanwhile, show none of this. White models pose in swimwear and kittens tumble out of baskets. For a century, the back of photo wallets has included photographic guidance in text or illustration. By the 1980s, these were photographic rogues galleries of bad practice. How not to do it guides depicted errors and issues that were in fact more likely to resemble the photographs inside the wallet than the professional photographs featured on the front. and the individual inspection that was promised by quality control technicians was meant to provide reassurance to customers to ward off protruding body parts and decapitated heads. The guidance that photo processors provided in those years, however, was more morally interventionist than photographic. It was a monitory gaze. And the archive of Boots the Chemist contains a fascinating file that reveals where the company's judgments were more than technical. I found this example from 1998, where armed police descended on the halls of residence of students dressed up as gangsters, toting toy guns for a photograph that Boots then reported to the police. And the article on the story reads, "They were just a pair of students fooling about by posing for a snapshot, dressed as urban terrorists with a couple of toy guns. But when the film was taken to Boots to be developed, staff took one glance at the dangerous-looking hombres with their menacing expressions and realistic weapons and phoned the police." The students are quoted in the article as saying, "If we really were criminals with illegal guns, do you think we'd take our photos to be developed at Boots?" The other photograph in that article relates to a more famous 1999 case in Britain where Boots turned over to police the family photographs of BBC News reader Julia Somerville, who had photographed her naked daughter in the bath, her young naked daughter in the bath. Her partner was arrested when he went to collect the photographs, but was later released without charge. The whole episode was characterised by the parents and the press as a gross invasion of privacy in the context of moral panics about child abuse. But notably, Photo Wallets had been promoting Baby in the Bath as a suitable photographic subject since at least the 1950s. To research popular experiences of using photo processing services, I analysed the writings collected by the British social research organisation called Mass Observation. Since 1937, this organisation has collected everyday life accounts by volunteer diarists and questionnaire respondents on matters large and small. In 2012, they gathered photographic memories from hundreds of contributors aged 19 to 91, and these were strongly clustered around times when things had gone wrong. There were sad stories of wallets of photographs of newborn babies lost in the post. There were funny stories when collecting photos after a Spanish holiday romance and the beautiful Roberto was sadly only visible from the knees down. And there were shocking stories too of photographic mix-ups where family snaps had somehow got exchanged with police fatal car crash photos. A bereaved daughter wrote how she had photographed her deceased parents in their coffins in a chapel of rest, but when she went to Boots to collect her prints, a supervisor took her aside to tell her off. Photo wallets repeatedly communicated messages of happiness and delight as suitable subjects. Death and mourning were discouraged by omission, but in that instance, the focus was explicitly vetoed. So the bad photo then might demonstrate technical shortcomings, but it may also transgress social norms. Getting it photographically wrong may not only include what anthropologist Richard Chalfin has called mechanical miscues, but it may also comprise errors of human judgment, although I think the human error in the previous example is on the part of the staff, not the customer. Chalfin's Photo Gaffes book of 2012 is structured around photographic insults and embarrassments, photographic etiquette and customs, that is, of photography's often unspoken rules and expectations. And errors, too, might not simply be instructive, they might, in fact, be a core characteristic of photography, an essential and implicit foundation, as art historian Chris Belden-Adams has argued in her 2017 book, Photography and Failure. And it may be, too, that popular photographic practice offers a particularly privileged set of materials from which to view that photographic fundamental. Photographic literature aimed at amateurs certainly has troubles failures and problems prominently scripted across its history. This is just a couple of examples of literature where the photographic novice is imagined and figured as an accident-prone, mistake-producing machine. The photographic error has been the subject of increased theoretical and curatorial attention in photography studies in recent years. Some examples include Ernst van Alphen's failed images of 2018 and Kim Beale's good pictures of 2020, alongside major photographic exhibitions, for example, Eric Kessel's in 2016 and Clement Charoux's Art of Mistakes in 2019. These scholars and curators argue that photographic orthodoxies necessarily produce, as shadow forms, photographic disruptions. Photographic good and bad, historically and geographically mobile as those moral and aesthetic categories may be, they are the points where norms reveal themselves, and they therefore offer lateral perspectives for understanding the photographic condition, or indeed, in the case of Eric Kessel's, for understanding the very nature of creativity. So Kessel's too has assembled his own collection of finger-in-the-lens photographs into a self-help guide to inspire the stuck, full of perverse but joyful advice about reveling in imperfection and having the courage to fail. By this logic, what he calls the most common fuck-up in photography, a ruined picture attacked, as he puts it, by a giant finger, can be reconfigured as a photographer's self-portrait. And for my closing section, I'd like to introduce you briefly to my new project, which looks at the long history of photography by children. 21st century children are now major media producers, and my current research examines the history of how we got here, how the child has been addressed and imagined as a distinctive photographic practitioner and a camera customer since the late 19th century. In 21st century media, the child photographer is frequently characterized as a problem. Children are perceived to be vulnerable, fragile, and at risk. Photography threatens their self-image and the very category of childhood innocence. But 100 years of photographic guidance tells a different set of stories. Children's capabilities and photography's capacities in children's hands have been imagined differently in different times. Yet the question, what can a child do with a camera, has an enduring answer across all these texts, and the answer is they make mistakes. So I said earlier that the amateur is a mistake-producing figure, and this is ramped up for the child as the most amateur of amateurs and the most novice of novices. Additionally, a perceived to be unruly child may be perceived to be in need of firmer rules, and rights and wrongs may be more moralizing when a child is addressed. And certainly, photographic errors cut across a century of children's instruction manuals, and that protruding digit is found again and again. Sometimes here as a scolding, nagging finger of how not to do it. But there is another dimension too to the error produced by the child's hand. And the spectre of the headless subject again appears in camera ads aimed at children where mother loses her head as a victim of her son's fatal framing. But the parental photographs that result may perhaps be read against the grain as a child's eye view of the world, as Freudian slips or photographic parapraxes betraying a child's priorities. And there's another curiosity too, in that beheading your family and friends is a lesson to be learned. Explicit photographic instruction on the death of the subject frequently appears in century-wide examples, here from the 1920s and here from 2000. The photographing child is frequently imagined as a handful. Their sticky fingers get everywhere they shouldn't. Camera adverts claim to override these deficiencies as foolproof devices, where children are always figured as the supreme photographic fool. So to conclude then, the erroneous photograph where the subject is obscured or beheaded might not be a failed photograph. It may in fact be a photograph that tells us about cultural expectations of success and error, accident and intention, wit and ambition, personal experience and business strategies, age abilities and camera technologies. Unwanted photographs may become wanted if we recognise that they provide photographic lessons and mistakes we can learn from. Thank you.